Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be studying the first 2 years, specifically looking at biosocial development. So to start off with, babies are born and then they start to grow, and they start to grow fast. And then it takes a bunch of years and eventually they grow up. But let's just start from the beginning. So newborns lose several ounces in the first few days and then gain an ounce a day for months. On averages, many healthy babies are not average. So again, don't just assume that everyone has to be average, but the birth weight tends to double by 4 months and then triples over a year. Plus, the average 7 pound newborn weighs about 21 pounds at 12 months. Height also increases rapidly. A typical newborn grows 10 inches by age 1. Variation is substantial. So again, we have your means, your averages, you have your percentiles, however you want to look at it. Those are just metrics just to give us a feel about where, somebody should be going along the stage and anything that we should be worried about. But again, the biggest things are going to be genes and nutrition that influence birth weight. And the smallest newborns often grow fastest, doubling their weight in 2 months, a phenomenon called catch-up growth. So again, don't always panic just because we might have something that might be a little bit over underweight or anything along those lines. Just to introduce it. Your book gets into sleep and it starts talking about the importance of sleep. And so in psychology, why do we need sleep? Why does our brain need rest? But then also the question is, what does our brain do when we're sleeping? So when we're sleeping, this is when our brain is encoding a lot of information. And it's theorized that REM sleep is used so that your brain can be constantly talking to your body. And so you have dreams so that your brain can send signals to your legs and your legs can send signals back to your brain so that your brain can always figure out how to use your body as it changes over time. And again, if you think about babies and what they're doing when they're sleeping, it says newborns often dream using REM, rapid eye movement sleep. Over the early weeks, they have a lot of REM, but then this does decrease over time. But why does a baby need that early REM? And again, one suggestion is that you are a brain inside of a body, and the baby needs to start to learn how to use its body. And then also babies sleep a lot because it takes a lot of time to encode all that information. So those are just some reasons for why maybe babies sleep more, for example. But by about 4 months, babies have what they call slow wave sleep or quiet sleep. And then, they start to sleep a little bit better throughout the night, depending upon the baby. But again, that in itself is completely arguable because what is a healthy baby? Does it a baby that sleeps through the night? Is that the goal of parenting, for example? So your book introduces a few variables that influence things like sleep. It suggests that sleep varies not only because of biological factors such as genetics and maturation, but also types of caregiving. So it talks about depending upon your region, some regions like North America, our whole goal is to separate them from their parents, put them in the crib, and try to get them to sleep throughout the night. But we find that throughout most of human history and also in other countries, that things like co-sleeping is much more common, so that adults can quickly respond to a hungry or frightened baby, for example. We have over time found that bed sharing and cohabitating with the baby is associated with SID, sudden infant death. But again, this idea of bed sharing is a common practice that has been used throughout most of the world. And again, in a lot of countries, is the goal to sleep throughout the night, or are some cultures just much more active? So the book talks about maybe sleeping through the night is a good ideal for many Western families, but that's not always the goal for other families. So again, depending upon your culture, depending upon your schedule, the way you guys, live your lives, that might determine the sleeping habits and what's more appropriate, for example. Okay. But when it comes to brain development, of course, this is the thing that grows the most in the first 2 years. During infancy, the brain grows more rapidly than any other organ, from 25% of an adult weight to 75% by age 2. So by age 2, you already have almost 75% of your overall brain size, and the rest of the body has to catch up a little bit. Your book also talks about things like if teething or a stuffy nose affects eating, the brain will grow before it lets the rest of the body grow. So again, this idea of brain growth being more important than body growth is a phenomenon called head sparing. Your book talks about it a little bit, but it's interesting in the idea that, nature does protect the brain. Does everything kind of go from the brain out is a really good question. So on the right side, I have a map over here of the brain. It shows you the outer brain and then a cross section of the brain. So on each side of the brain, you have four lobes. This can be argued to be six, depending upon what you're talking about. But the main four that most people talk about are going to be your prefrontal cortex. You're going to have your auditory cortex, your visual cortex, and then your cerebral cortex. And then for the lobes of the brain, we're going to have, your occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, the frontal lobe, and then, yeah, all right. Harlow, I'm recording a video. What are you doing? Aren't you guys doing stuff upstairs? Go back upstairs. Close that door. So you have your prefrontal cortex, or the frontal lobe for your higher level thinking. You have your auditory cortex or the temporal lobe for hearing. You have your parietal lobe, and that's usually responsible for touch and feel. And then you have your occipital lobe for visual. There are two other lobes that don't often get talked about, and we won't, introduce them too much in this one. But there's the insula or the insular lobe, and that is responsible for emotions, and then, some things like that. But again, the main four is what you really need to be focusing on. So for this chapter, it does introduce the processes, some of the vocabulary. So again, the way cellular transmission works in the brain is, a cell, is stimulated, and then, the action potential crosses the threshold. It then releases chemicals, neurotransmitters across the synapse. Which are then, absorbed by the dendrites to the next neuron. And then when that absorbs enough, information, and that stimulates another, threshold to send the signal all the way down. And then what holds the signal from skipping out into space is the myelin sheath, that little wrapping, or, if you think about it like electrical wires, it's basically like the what insulates an electrical wire. And then you also get introduced to the limbic system, which is the center of your brain. And that's another, what they could say is a lobe, the limbic lobe. But again, it's usually considered more like a limbic system. Same thing with the insular lobe. These are responsible for emotions and motivations and things along those lines. But again, it's arguable whether or not those are considered lobes. And then you have the amygdala, which is responsible for emotions. You have the hippocampus that's responsible for memory. And again, it's good to start getting introduced to the structure of the brain, the parts of the brain, what does what. It is incredibly complex. And when you guys get later into like sensation and perception, when you really have to study all the parts of the brain and what's responsible for what, and then trace those neurons all the way to all the parts of the body, it's very much more complicated. So it's cool anatomy. So always with psychology, you end up getting exposed to anatomy, but I won't, drag you guys out too much on this. Okay. So during your first couple of years and even right before you're born, you have, that massive cell death. And then your brain is always constantly pruning, like trimming a tree. Imagine like a Japanese maple tree or something. And if you let it grow, it just becomes super wild and bushy. And so often people will trim it and then just to kind of have like your main branch lines or your main neural pathways. And again, I always think about it like a highway system. As we evolve and we create interstates, then old highways like Route 66 are no longer as used as much. And so your brain kind of cuts out Route 66, and then any town that existed along Route 66 that didn't have another reason for existing tended to get cut out itself. And so again, your body, your brain is always going through and removing things that are no longer used. But what really grows during the early years are those dendrites, okay? The ability to absorb information. So what you see is extreme dendrite growth, and this is called transient exuberance. It's called exuberant because it happens so rapid, and transient because some of it's temporary. So you have this massive dendrite growth trying to connect everything, but then your brain goes through and prunes everything that is no longer being used. Okay. So when it comes to stimuli needs, Babies need stimuli. If you do not socialize the child and then they are stuck in a closet, for example, they don't develop. So your book breaks it down into experience expectant growth and then experience dependent growth. Experience expectant growth are the things that have to be done. For example, if you don't interact with the child, if you don't give them enough nutrition for the brain growth, if you don't stimulate them in certain ways, make eye contact, hold them, they can be affected over time. And then experience dependent growth is more culturally based because, some cultures will stimulate babies in some ways and other cultures won't do that at all. And so, again, all of these things influence the way your brain grows, but then we also just always need to separate it by what does a baby actually need, which is, contact, someone to talk to, the use of language, sight, sounds, emotional expressions, all kinds of social interaction. The thing is, babies, humans, we're all obsessed with people. And so we need the interaction with the people. And it turns out that if we don't interact with people, then it does negatively affect your development. Language is a natural thing that we learn. But again, if you don't teach a child language, by the time they're age 5, then you can see some things like permanent development. And, when you get into the cases of the trauma where true kids have been locked in the closets and we have the cases of feral children, that's where we have those stories. So when it comes to trauma, babies can be trauma. All babies do cry, okay? Because the prefrontal cortex, this part of your brain, is undeveloped. Telling a baby to stop crying is pointless because they cannot decide to stop crying. You need that developed prefrontal cortex to be able to make those decisions about how you can manage your emotions much more consciously. And for most of this takes a lifetime. But again, this part of your brain doesn't really fully develop until you're around 25 years old. Mastering your emotions, being able to be cool in situations, not being out of control. These are things that humans have to learn over time as we develop emotional development and we develop our executive decision making. Okay? So some adults yell at babies, which terrifies them, or even worse, shake them. Shaking babies breaks blood cells in the brain, causing shaken baby syndrome. Death is the worst consequence. Lifelong intellectual impairment is the more likely one. Your book gets into all kinds of little things about what traumatizes kids, but babies are susceptible to things like parents fighting in a car, for example. So we need to be aware of that. So perception and motion. Young human infants have an odd combination. They have immature modal abilities, but their senses are like on fire. Albeit they can't necessarily like run and do all this cool stuff. They are just taking in information. Hence the bright-eyed baby just being aware and being like, woohoo, you know what I mean? Because they want to take it in. Now, this is different than most mammals. Like cats, for example, are born already able to walk, but the rest of it takes a little bit of time. Humans, all of our senses are ready to go pretty much the second we come out of the womb, but it takes a little while for us to figure out how to use our bodies, okay? So newborns have open eyes, sensitive ears, and responsive noses, tongues, and skin. They are ready to go. Just after birth, humans stare at everything, they hark at any noise, and they suck whatever touches their lips. They are ready to go. We are born with this desire to live and the desire to take in information, okay? However, our perception comes later. This takes the ability to frame our situations and to understand the context and to know everything that's happening. And again, that takes in a very, very long time. So when we get into sensation and perception, and this will be a later class for most psychology students, sensation is just stimuli, receiving stimuli, and then perception is the ability to make sense of that stimuli and then to take it in and interpret that stimuli. Now, your brain is always interpreting that stimuli, but for your conscious mind to also catch up takes a long time. Your unconscious processes are always taking in information, making sense out of things, even if your conscious mind isn't doing it. Okay, so you can say that we are unconsciously perceiving, but then the real moment of clarity comes when we can consciously do that. Okay, so sensation occurs when a sensory system detects a stimuli, as when the inner ear reverberates with sound, or the eye's retina and the pupil intercept light. So light comes into our eye, it stimulates the neurons in the back of our retina. which causes those neurons to release neurotransmitters, communicate with the next neuron through the dendrites, then stimulating that neuron. And then all that information, that constant stimulating of cells, goes into our brain. And then our brain interprets those signals as something. And again, it's that interpretation, and then even further, the conscious interpretation, that is the perception. However, you can have sensations without perception. And you could say that perception is like that moment of awareness. But again, I always like to make the distinction between unconscious and conscious awareness, because unconsciously you can become aware of stuff, but maybe it just doesn't tell your conscious mind to also be aware of it also. Okay, so genetic selection over thousands of years affects the senses. We are born with a range. We can only see three colors, red, blue, and green. We can only hear a certain range of sounds, whereas other animals can see different colors than we can. They have better night vision and they can hear more sounds. For whatever reason, throughout evolutionary psychology, what we have is what we get. These are the senses we are born with, but these have been influenced over millions of years of, evolution. Okay, humans cannot hear what the dogs hear, see what eagles see, or smell what mice smell. And again, why did we evolve to be this way? Our brain has decided that maybe taking in that information is too much information. Why can't we store all the information of everything we've ever, heard? Well, there's a reason that they say that, photographic memories are a curse, because if you are taking in every information, you can't forget anything, then anytime something reminds you of something, it's going to remind you of a whole bunch of stuff, for example. So, people do not need those senses to be astonishingly accurate. So those abilities have atrophied over a 200,000 year development of the human brain. However, survival required that humans respond to each other. As you will see, newborns respond to people with every sense. So over time, we might not be able to see, like, as far as we used to, as keenly as we used to, but where our survival has gone is more to each other. We need to work with each other. And so our genetics, our DNA have figured out that by being a social creature and working with each other, that can ensure our longevity over time. So we are all born with this innate desire to go be social. Babies are born with the need to be social. They will cry out for someone to hug them and hold them. They will cry out for lack of stimuli. They want to be stimulated. Thus, sensations begin when an outer organ, an eye, ear, nose, tongue, or skin meets anything that can be seen, heard, smelled, tasted, or touched. Stop for a moment to listen. I like this. So the whole time I've been talking, just stop for a second. Now listen for your heater or your air conditioning. Can you hear it? Did you hear it a few seconds ago? And again, this is kind of the idea. You're always taking in stimuli, but your brain is not always going to make you conscious of that stimuli until there's some reason to be conscious of it. Like you won't think about your heater or your air conditioning until it starts making a really weird sound. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, what's that sound? And now your conscious mind is trying to figure it out. And all of a sudden you're focused on the heat, the air that you never were before. There's little things like that. All right. So for motor skills, a motor skill is any deliberate movement of the body. These motor skills start with reflexes, which become skills if they are practiced and encouraged. Deliberate actions that coordinate many parts of the body produce large movements. These are called gross motor movements. These skills emerge directly from reflexes and proceed in a cephalocaudal, head down, and proximodistal, center out direction. Thus, by 2 months, infants control their heads, lift them up to look around. Then they learn to control their upper bodies, their arms, and then finally they learn to use their legs and their feet. And deliberate small body movements are called fine motor skills. And these fine motor skills are not developed until much longer. For example, our ability to draw a line, for example, I think the ability to draw a line and starts about 3 years old. Around 3 years old is when a human can do the fine motor skills. To wrap it up, your book talks about health and the importance of nutrition, and it also delves into immunizations. Your book talks about how things like compared with cow's milk, human milk is more digestible, sterile, and contains nutrients that are not yet known. It is suggested from the book that breastfeeding could be better than drinking cow's milk, for example. Now, again, I'm not going to claim to like get into all the debates on this. So again, just take what your book is saying, look at the research, and see what it's saying. It says that people that are breastfed have less allergies and less asthma. When they become adults, they have lower rates of obesity, lower rates of diabetes, lower rates of heart disease. The AAP, the American Association of Pediatricians, recommends exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months. And then after 6 months, between you, the mother, the child, the doctor, you guys kind of figure out what works out best for you. And then again, this is also culturally affected. So in the Americas, is the goal to stop breastfeeding by 6 months or a year? Is it frowned upon if you're still breastfeeding at 2 years? And so your book gets into all of that. Okay. Worldwide, young children are the most likely to suffer from malnutrition that affects their body and brain growth. Again, the most important thing for brain growth is, did you eat today? So, a child suffering from stunting, stunted growth, being short for their age, caused by chronic malnutrition, or wasting away, being severely underweight, can affect the long and short-term growth of the brain and body. Also, things that affect the long and short-term growth of the brain and the body includes diseases such as measles, chickenpox, polios, mumps, rotavirus, and whooping cough. These have been rare because of immunizations. However, we've started to see a spike in a lot of these since there's been some resistance to immunizations. Okay. But that being said, immunization is said to have had a greater impact on human mortality reduction and population growth than any other public health intervention besides clean water, because no longer do we have to die of those childhood diseases that can be preventable. Okay. So again, the effects of malnutrition. Learning is impaired. Diseases cause, such as diarrhea, malaria, and pneumonia. Tuberculosis can be fatal if a child is undernourished. Some diseases result from malnutrition, such as marasmus during the first year when the body tissues wear away, kwashiorkor, when the growth slows down, and I'm thinking about the war zones right now in, the Middle East, in Gaza, and thinking about what the doctors are reporting from women having babies, and these babies are severely malnourished, and then what happens to those babies over the time. And then your book says the usual joys of childhood, such as play, curiosity, excitement, diminish with low energy and increased depression of hunger. And over here, you can see the stunting of body and brain growth by world region. And again, socioeconomic status and access to healthcare is directly correlated to increased viability. Okay, so again, this is just us starting to introduce some ideas, starting to introduce, the structures of the brain, how these grow over time, looking at the growth of babies' bodies, over time, and, we'll start to slowly delve into this over time. All right, thanks, y'all. Have a wonderful one.